Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be covering the gold medal match from Sword Strong 2023. Yes, that is a match that's almost a year old now, but I'm going back because, well, I've run enough tournament footage of my own, and this was a really good match that I feel like needs covering. One, it features both Benjamin A. Krigg and Jeremy Pace. Jeremy's been on the channel before, but A. Krigg has not, and he has been doing very well in the tournament circuit, and I thought it would be pretty good to explain why and what his favorite techniques are and how he executes them. So let's get started. So for our first exchange, it's a little bit of a slow one, and this is a Midwest tournament, which means that the rings are pretty small. But there is still a lot of good footwork and good techniques on display here. And the one thing that I want to point out first off is that Benjamin A. Krigg has a very unique way of parrying. He always throws an active parry, or a Zornhau, towards his opponent's blow. You can see that on display here. Every time Jeremy comes forward, he throws a little bit of a hand strike. Benjamin isn't just moving his guard into position in order to defend his hands, he is actively hitting his opponent's sword with his sword. Again, this is called the Zornhau, and this is not something you see a lot in tournament fencing. And in this exchange, you see a little bit why, and that's because every time you want to throw a blow into your opponent's blow, well, there's always the chance that it was a feint, and now you are throwing some momentum and some force towards something that is no longer there, which of course opens up your targets on the other side. And again, that's what we see here. Jeremy comes in, he throws a little bit of a feinted strike on the right side, pulls it up, throws another one on the left side, and manages to clip Ben in the elbow before he is able to move from his left side to his right side and keep his hands safe. So our second exchange is a little bit more interesting here because we see how each fencer tries to set up their stab game, particularly with their Zorn Orts. And in this case, we see Jeremy throw a Geistling that does not land, but works as a little bit of a setup to get Ben to back up a little bit. Again, these rings are very small, so anytime any one of these fencers takes even one step back, they are now at the edge of the ring and can no longer take another, which means that at the exact same time as Jeremy starts to walk forward after he's thrown his Geistling, Ben immediately throws another classic Zorn, but this time he does it in a very interesting way. He sinks his weight and his hips down and bends very deep into his right leg and throws that Zorn over to his left hip. The idea of this is that this does a very good job of closing off that entire line and getting low enough that maybe if Jeremy had thrown kind of a middle Hau towards the hands, he still would be able to pick it up with his blade. However, Jeremy doesn't really fully commit with his attacks coming forward and ends up on the right side of that Zorn. At this exact moment, Ben makes the decision to try to go up into a Kron and shoot a Shield Hau directly over the top into the neck of Jeremy. And from this camera angle, it does look like it does not work. It just looks like the range wasn't quite there. But one thing that's important to consider here is that Ben's game plan here was to Zorn very hard into a bind, come up into a Kron Hau or a Kron position, and then shoot that Shield Hau over the top into the face. And that is a very, very good description of how you can pull off Zorn Haus yourself. A lot of people don't throw Zorn Haus because, as I said before, they tend to leave you open. But if you do manage to get a really strong bind out of a Zorn Hau, meaning that your strong is on the weak of their sword and you've managed to push them offline to a position where they can no longer stab you, this exact pattern is a great follow-up. Going up into a Kron position is a great way to ensure that you have placed the blade exactly where you want it to be, and then flicking or shooting that Shield Hau over the top of your opponent's guard is a great way to take advantage of the opening that you now have. Knowing that A, in order to parry it themselves, they're going to have to shoot their own guard straight up into the air because they have to push your blade up or to the side in order to protect themselves. And more importantly, it means that because you started off with control of the bind, they're going to have to pull their sword backwards in order to get their strong onto your weak to make sure that they can actually do that. This combination of techniques means that you are forcing your opponent to go from an extended position to a retracted position, and that they have to fully commit to a parry, which, as you know in sword fighting, is always a great position to be in. One in which your opponent has to fully commit to defend means that they either get hit or they stay safe, and in both of those situations, you don't get hit back. Of course, I still have to describe the end of this exchange. It looks like Jeremy was able to flex out and not really get onto the outside position, but the inside position, and is able to stab Ben in the face. Now, thankfully, somebody else recorded an alternate angle, so we can see that happening a lot more clearly, and Ben throws some paltry hand shots or arm shots after he's already been stabbed in the face, mostly just as a way to try to get out of that position. So for our third exchange, we have another really interesting interaction with the Zornhau. Now, if you read the texts, as all good HEMA fighters should, you know that the Zornhau is not merely a defense, but also a simultaneous offense. But we don't see that a lot, and primarily that's because it's really, really difficult to swing a Zornhau hard enough to cleave through someone's guard and then into their person. But we can see a little bit from Ben here how that might be done. The exact same time, we see another application from Jeremy of the Duplirin, which also, brings up its benefits and, its losses. But what we see here from this particular interaction is Jeremy throws another hand shot and Ben Zornhau's hard into it, as he has been doing up till now. At the exact same time as this happens, Jeremy starts to take a step back, realizing that he's in a bad bind position, and Benjamin makes an interesting choice to pull off, take a step forward, and throw another Zornhau. Now, in this particular case, he throws it across the middle at about the shoulder line, and this is not where most people throw their Zornhaus. Most people throw their Zornhaus much higher. But in my opinion, this is a far smarter place to throw your Zornhaus, because the middling kind of angle with your tip pointed a little bit up in the air does a much better job of closing off the lines that your opponent is most likely to actually take. In this case, Jeremy comes down the high line pretty vertically onto the head, and this Zornhau almost does a good enough job of sweeping it all the way off to the side. The reason is that this middling angle means that his strong is higher up and closer to his shoulders, where your opponent's blade is most likely to go. It doesn't really work out for him here, but what does work is that Jeremy is able to double over the top, Duplirin over the top, and manage to get on the inside of that Zornhau and smack Ben in the face, where at the exact same time Ben is able to Zorn that cut completely off to the side, though it does get stuck on his head, and at the exact same time make contact with the shoulder. This is again one of those executions of the Zornhau you don't normally see, because parrying and hitting at the same time is really, really difficult to do. But if you're willing to take this particular kind of Zornhau and move it to this line and in this position, you might find it works out for you a lot better. Next up, we have yet another application of the Zornhau, though it is what Ben has been trying, at least as far as I can tell, to set up this entire time, which is the more traditional Zorn Ort, meaning that you Zorn your opponent out of position, and then you follow it up with a thrust. And that's exactly what happens here. Jeremy throws yet another hand strike, Ben Zorns into it yet again, only this time as Jeremy starts to back up, Ben does not pull off of the dominant position that he has gained, he instead leverages it further to his left side and drives the tip forward. And if you watch this particular exchange, you can see why the Zornhaus are so rarely used, but why, if used effectively, it can really do three things at once. When we watch this particular exchange, what we see is Ben simultaneously extending his arms forward at the level of his shoulder, keeping his tip just a little bit high and his hands just a little bit low so that it has that little bit of a angle to his sword, crossing directly horizontal across his middle line, and accomplishing three things. One, he manages to shove his opponent's blade off to the side. And this is the most obvious application of a Zornhau. You're physically attacking someone else's blade. The goal should always be to push them off to the side. But the reason this position is beneficial is by extending his hands and keeping them at the level of the shoulder, he's putting his strong into about the middle of his opponent's blade, which means he has superior leverage in that bind. It also means that because he's stepping forward, he has that little bit of extra oomph and momentum that will allow him to deliver this simultaneously as a parry and also as a strike. In this particular instance, Jeremy was able to back up far enough to not get hit by the cut that came across his midline, but in the previous exchange, you saw the opposite. Jeremy did not get far enough away, and what that means is that when Ben threw this really hard middle how, you might call it, across the middle, he was able to land on the shoulder, thus doing the second thing, which is delivering a cut. Now, in this exchange, he does the third thing, which is if your opponent does back up far enough and you have pushed them all the way out to the side, you then drive your point forward and deliver a thrust, the third thing. And the reason this is so effective is that it all works from the exact same position in the exact same motion. By sweeping your arms across your shoulder line from right to left, you are pretty much guaranteed to take care of any cut or thrust that your right-handed opponent might be throwing into that quadrant or that middle line. At the exact same time, if they stay too close, you hit them with the cut, and if they start to back up, you can hit them with the thrust. A perfect little flow chart of fencing moves that all works off of the exact same position. Now, we've seen earlier what can go wrong, where if you throw your Zorn and there's nothing there, you're probably going to get hit in the hands. But if you do throw your Zorn and there is something there, there's a lot of really good follow-ups you can pull off of this. Even if your opponent manages to back up and push your Zorn or out of the way, your thrust out of the way, you're still in a really great position to shove your opponent out of the ring, which is what we're going to see soon from these fighters. Next up, we have our pushing exchanges. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this ring is extremely small, and both of these fencers so far have been doing a pretty good job of trying to maintain their distance, but now they're both starting to get aggressive and they're both starting to pull out their big forward momentum moves, and what that means is that something is going to have to give. Either someone's going to get pushed out of the ring, or they're both going to come forward at the same time and kind of mash into each other. And in this case, what we see is Jeremy trying to take advantage of that knowledge by throwing a pretty nice setup. So what happens here is we see a cheeky little hand shot from Ben that doesn't land and gets parried. But exactly as this happens, Jeremy makes a really good decision here to go up into a Kron and feint one Zverk and then throw the opposite Zverk. And you see Ben here trying to figure out which Zverk Jeremy is going to throw as he backs up. Of course, taking that crucial second step back that puts him out of the ring with one leg. At this point, Jeremy decides to throw the left Zverk, which is my favorite Zverk, and just barely doesn't make it far enough to hit the arm of Ben. However, he does another really smart thing here, which is that immediately upon feeling any kind of contact with that left Zverk, he disconnects his left hand and he starts immediately trying to grapple. However, the grapple he does is one that I have some problems with. In this particular case, what he does is he sticks his left hand up in the air, he grabs both of Ben's hands, and kind of Mr. Miyagi whacks offs them towards his left hip. And what this results in is a position that you see a lot in the texts, where Jeremy has both of Ben's arms and him a little bit off balance towards his left arm, but he has to do so with both of his own arms, resulting in both swords and all four arms tangled up in this low kind of hip position. And the problem I have with this is that this is not a position from which you can do a whole lot. Your sword is bound up, same as your opponent's, and the second anybody gets into this position, they're immediately going to disconnect their left hand and shoot it towards your sword, resulting in a situation which we don't really see play out here because it doesn't last long enough, in which both people will probably have control of the opponent's blade, but at full arm's length, meaning that they can't pull their sword, they can't use their weapon, but they're also not close enough to each other to actually do any kind of meaningful grappling, resulting in a very boring and very difficult to work with stalemate. This is not what I would do. Now, what I would do instead is, as Jeremy throws his left hand up, which is exactly what you should do, what he should focus on doing is getting his elbow and the inside of his tricep over both of his opponent's arms, and basically do the exact same motion, pull both of Ben's arms towards his left hip, but do so while trying to make chest-to-chest contact. What this allows you to do is free up your right arm, your sword arm, and do things with your own weapon in this exact same position. Now, if the scenario happens where your opponent lets go with your left arm and tries to start finding your own sword, what this means is that you're going to be in chest-to-chest contact, and even if they get a hold of your sword, you're now in a stalemate position where you can actually wrestle. You're actually in a position where you can throw, where you can pick somebody up, where you can put them down gently, and even if throws are banned in your tournament, you can at least have a stalemate where there's a chance you can pull out a dagger or use your sword to some kind of usefulness, whereas opposed to the other scenario where you're at arm's length and you just can't free your sword and there's just literally nothing you can do. So, a really good exchange from Jeremy here with maybe just one note that he could maybe work on. Next up, we have another pushing exchange, only this time initiated by Ben. He throws a cheeky Geistling, uses it to cover his advance, throws the Zornhau, and then tries to throw another one. But Jeremy here does something very smart as he starts to back up, and that is use a concept known as stiff arming. Now, if you know anything about football, or American football, I guess, you know stiff arming is that thing you do where you stick your arm out there and you shove it against your opponent's head. And the idea is that it does two things. One, it starts to divert their momentum from going straight at you to somewhere off to the side. And it does another thing, which is give you a sense of where that momentum is now going so that you can go somewhere else, therefore keeping yourself safe from the tackle. And in fencing, it's pretty similar. However, you don't do it to the head. What you do it to is your opponent's hands. Now, as you watch this bind occur, where Ben comes forward with his Zornhau, you see both the strongs of their blades lock together and push immediately. And what Jeremy does is he extends his hands forward and keeps them locked out there. And the reason this is smart to do is, just like in the football example, it forces Ben to start pushing against both of his arms together. And not only does that mean that Jeremy gets to put his entire weight and structure behind his hands, it keeps him at a distance where he cannot get into that chest-to-chest contact that you generally need for good grappling. It also means that as Ben is pushing harder and harder forward, it's significantly more likely that since he's pushing against the two stick objects that are sticking out from Jeremy's body, that he's going to end up accidentally diverting to one side or another. As soon as Jeremy feels Ben starts to push to one side, in this case his left side, he follows that momentum and goes to his own right, which allows him to pull off finally as Ben is starting to stumble forward with his second or third step and throw a little bit of a cheeky hip shot just as both of them exit the ring. Now, I don't believe that this cut ended up counting, but it is a good example of what you can do if someone is desperately trying to get into grapple range with you and you want to stop their momentum coming forward. A lot of the times, the only good way to stop a grapple is to meet them in the middle with your own forward momentum. But sometimes that's not always how it works out. Your opponent is the one who started walking first, and trying to meet someone's forward momentum with your static no momentum is often a losing battle and exactly what they want you to do. So this stiff arm technique is a great way to allow yourself to move backwards and stay away from the person who's currently charging you, but put up a structured defense of their charge so that you can actually get around to the side. Because doing so, or trying to get around to the side without any kind of structure and without the stiff arm, usually results in you just getting rushed and grabbed and grappled. That is going to be everything here. I did end up skipping the last exchange because it's not particularly interesting, and I don't really care who won this fight. What I do care about is this explanation and this demonstration of the Zornhau and all the different ways that it can be used to get you some points, or the ways that you can try to counteract it. But if you think that I am wrong about the Zornhau and I'm misinterpreting the sources, feel free to say so below, and I'll see you on Thursday.